Imagine stepping into a war zone, right? But the primary threat actually isn't the artillery raining down or the infantry charging at you. No, the greatest threat is literally the air you breathe, the blistering ground under your boots, and this dense, suffocating brush surrounding you on every single side. Welcome to our explainer on the Chaco War. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most brutal, strategically fascinating conflicts of the 20th century. We're taking a real War College-level look at the Chaco Boreal, and we aren't looking at it as just a passive battlefield. No, it was a lethal, living system. Before you could even think about fighting the opposing army, you had to conquer the Green Hell. The enemy does not always wear a uniform. Now, in military strategy, it's so easy to get caught up counting tanks, rifles, and troop numbers, right? But in the Chaco War, the ultimate antagonist, the force that literally inflicted agonizing casualties and completely derailed these grand textbook military strategies, was the extreme environment itself. Listen, if you didn't respect this invisible enemy, you were absolutely doomed before you even fired a single shot.
Section 1. The enemy without a uniform.
Okay, so surviving here, that was a massive combat operation in its own right. We are talking about punishing, relentless heat that baked troops alive, paired with a terrifying absence of surface water. The terrain itself was defined by this incredibly dense, closed brush, thorny vegetation so tight, so impenetrable you couldn't see a man standing 10 feet in front of you. Add in choking dust, rampant disease, and total logistical isolation, and you can see how this environment acted as a natural defense mechanism. Any invading force didn't just march into the Chaco, they bled into it.
Section 2. Clash of Military Doctrines.
So, what happens when textbook military theory slams headfirst into unforgiving reality? Well, the friction is absolutely devastating. On one side, you had armies trained in post-World War I European doctrine. This doctrine demanded rigid, continuous front lines and these massive, slow-moving logistical chains. They just assumed the terrain would be predictable enough to maneuver large divisions. But the Chaco reality? It made continuous lines physically impossible. Combat completely devolved into these isolated, chaotic pockets of fighting where massive supply columns were blind, trapped, and just incredibly vulnerable.
You know, operational plans that looked perfectly beautiful on massive map boards in high command headquarters, they completely disintegrated upon contact with the impenetrable Chaco brush. The rigid formations simply broke apart. It's a brutal historical lesson we see time and time again. The map is not the territory. And here, the territory actively devoured the map.
Section 3. Water as the strategic center of gravity.
Let's talk strategy for a second. Karl von Clausewitz famously defined the strategic center of gravity as the hub of all power and movement, on which everything depends. Now, in the Chaco War, this wasn't a capital city. It wasn't a heavily fortified bunker. It was exclusively the control of water. Think about that. Whichever army controlled the rare, scattered wells completely dictated mobility and total combat capacity. Without water, a division of 10,000 men wasn't just slowed down, they were completely neutralized in under 48 hours.
And this created an absolutely agonizing logistical chain. First, you had to physically secure these distant, heavily contested wells. Second, transport that water via incredibly vulnerable supply lines, driving trucks through narrow brush paths that were practically custom-made for an ambush. And finally, you had to actually deliver that water to desperately thirsty frontline troops. A single disruption anywhere in this chain, it didn't just mean a minor tactical setback. No, it meant the rapid, horrific destruction of an entire unit by dehydration. Out there, water wasn't just supplies. It was literally ammunition for survival.
Section 4. Local knowledge and tactical adaptation.
So how do you win a war when the terrain itself is actively trying to kill you? Well, the Paraguayan military realized pretty quickly that stubbornly fighting the environment was basically suicide. Adaptation was the only real path forward. So they completely discarded those rigid, inflexible doctrines we talked about earlier in favor of intense local expertise. They utilized local guides, known as vaquianos, who actually understood the hidden pathways of the Chaco. They integrated indigenous tracking techniques, adopted culturally to travel much lighter, and strategically shifted to a decentralized squad-level command structure.
By empowering subordinate, lower-level officers to actually take the initiative, the Paraguayan army created an infinitely more agile force. I mean, think about it. In dense brush with near-zero visibility, the squad leader on the ground knows vastly more about the immediate tactical reality than a commanding general sitting hundreds of miles away in a tent. Allowing for real-time reactions to a completely unpredictable environment is what kept them alive, and more importantly, kept them moving forward.
Section 5. Victory through tactical flexibility. This contrast right here is what decided the war.
On one hand, you had the extreme difficulties of an inflexible command tied down by deeply stretched, highly vulnerable supply lines. And on the other hand, you're facing off against subordinate initiative and true, genuine local terrain mastery. What you should really take away from this explainer is that the ultimate victor wasn't decided simply by who had superior firepower or the biggest army or the most modern weapons. It was decided by operational flexibility. It was the willingness to let the reality of the ground dictate the strategy rather than the other way around.
Through this mastery, the Paraguayan forces achieved something truly incredible. They essentially transformed the Chaco itself from a paralyzing, deadly obstacle into their own decisive strategic weapon. There is a deeply powerful historical analogy here. Just as the brutal winter famously defeated invading armies in Russia, the scorching green hell of the Chaco destroyed those who could not or just stubbornly would not adapt to its unbreakable rules. Ultimately, nature always bats last.
But surviving the terrain, as difficult as it was, is really only half the battle. Once you've adapted, you have to actually strike. Which leaves us with an absolutely critical question to ponder. If mastering the terrain was merely step one, how does operational speed, the ability to move and strike faster than your paralyzed enemy can even react, become the ultimate weapon to deliver the final blow? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. I'll see you next time as we continue to unpack the brilliant, chaotic reality of strategic military history.